Thank you so much for having me, and my apologies for joining in late. This became a very busy week. As you know, we are just about to travel to Glasgow, and there are many events lined up. I normally don't believe in appearing in an event and then just leave the discussion. So my sincere apologies. But I'm going to make a presentation and also stay for the discussion if you have any questions, because I have to go back and attend another meeting. I'm also part of Climate Action Network. So we are actually doing our strategy meeting, and one of the components that I am leading on loss and damage. So I have to be part of that meeting as well. So I'll make a short presentation to share a bit more about the treaty. Tell me if you can see and if it is full screen.
Yes. Yes, Harjeet, perfect. Perfect.
Yeah. So yeah, as you said, this is a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. It's a bold project. It's to phase out fossil fuels and support a global just transition. So and I'm going to talk a bit more about, and let me start with the context. I know my previous speakers have already talked about climate change and justice, so I don't need to get into a lot of details. I'm going straight what we are doing at the treaty. So why do we need a treaty? If you look at the context, the reality is that when we should be reducing our emissions and fossil fuel extraction, the reality is that 120% has more planned fossil fuel production than what is consistent with 1.5 degree. So imagine we have a target of staying below 1.5, but the plans of fossil fuel corporation for the production is 120% more, which means that we are going to really blow up the target and we are not on track. And if you look at it from a carbon budget perspective, just developed countries reserve, if they use all the reserves, it's going to blow up the chance entirely, where we have to be really halving the emissions. And as you know, IPCC told us clearly that we should be halving our emissions by 2030 based on our 2010 emission levels. And here we are, we look at fossil fuel plants, which are going to be much more than what we should be burning right now. And the other thing that we have to do is to look at this whole issue of fossil fuel production, connecting it with other crises. We know that fossil fuel systems are responsible for more than 80% of carbon dioxide. But we also know that it's a complex system. It's integrated with energy, financial, and other systems. And there are so many vested interests that play behind that interest. And at the same time, we are living in a world which has been defined by historical and existing inequalities. We are not living in an equal world. We have been talking about inequality, 1% versus 99%. So some people have more resources than the rest of the world. So how do we look at that challenge and the kind of transition that is required? If we do not have a plan, if it is not orderly, there's going to be a stability challenge in so many ways, whether we talk about energy crisis and look at where we are. We're already facing energy crisis in Europe, in China, in India, and many parts of the world. And this is just the beginning of it, because again, points to the same fact. Do we have a plan? Are we going in an orderly manner? So that really takes us to a stability challenge, which we cannot ignore. And of course, we have a Paris Agreement, which talks about dealing with climate change. But guess what? Paris Agreement does not mention coal, oil, and gas. Yeah, that's right. If you are hearing it for the first time, that's the reality. So the main cause of the problem, fossil fuels, have not been mentioned in the Paris Agreement. And that's why we need a treaty, which means we are not looking at the source of the problem. We are just telling countries to reduce their emissions. We are not putting any cap on how much we can extract. We are talking about emissions, but we are not talking about fossil fuel extraction. And that is a fundamental problem that we have right now. Whereas the world is telling, the recent International Energy Agency report tells us there is no need for investment in new fossil fuel supply if we really want to stick to that net zero pathway, which means by 2050, we should be carbon neutral. If we have to halve the emissions by 2030, we should become carbon neutral as the global community by 2050. And for that, we don't need any new investments. And the Secretary General said on the IPCC report that was released recently that it should be a death knell for the coal and other fossil fuels before they destroy our planet. So we know the problem, we know the solution, but we are not acting upon it because we do not have the right framework in place. And that is the challenge that we are facing. And considering that we started this whole campaign on fossil fuel treaty, we need to look at fossil fuel as the main problem, as the elephant in the room. And that's exactly what this treaty does. So what are our objectives? We want to change the global norms on fossil fuels by demonstrating widespread action. On the supply side, we want to provide the missing framework. So Paris Agreement takes us on a pathway, but that's not enough. We need something more multilateral agreements for a just transition. And that is the missing framework. And we also want to join and grow the global movement that talks about energy transition and, of course, transition in so many sectors. We are talking about transport, we are talking about health sector, we are talking about education, we are talking about, every sector has to be transformed. So all aspects of our life would be changing. That's the kind of challenge we have. So what do? So we motivate cities and states to endorse the treaty so that they can phase out coal, oil, and gas. They put that as their commitment. We want to increase transparency and accountability on fossil fuel expansion and extraction. And that's why we have worked on the registry that I'm going to talk about later, and complement frontline and finance campaigns with a unifying political demand. So we need to have a unifying demand and not something that divides us. And that's where, again, treaty plays a very important role. Now, why do we need a global cooperation? We can say, please go and just reduce your extraction. And then, as other reports have said, but is that so easy? And this matrix tells you where we are. So there are countries who are doing more extraction, but at the same time, if you look at the capacity they have to make the just transition vis-a-vis the revenues that they get from oil, for instance, it's a massive inequality that we need to acknowledge. So for the US, which does extraction, but if you look at their capacity, it is way, way higher, which means if it has to make the transition, it will not affect it so much. Whereas if you look at a country like Algeria or Azerbaijan, they, on one hand, have a lot more dependency on oil share of revenues, or Angola or Nigeria, but where they have very little capacity in terms of their economic power, which means they are going to find it extremely hard to make the transition. And we can keep doing all kinds of campaign and keep telling them, you have to make a transition. But if they do not have resources and if there is no international cooperation, that transition is not going to happen. So we have to start plotting different countries based on their dependence on fossil fuel and the capacity. And that should become an input for the kind of international cooperation that we need to reach. So the treaty that we have is based on nuclear weapons treaty. So we have learned a lot from that, from non-proliferation aspect, from disarmament and the peaceful transition. And learning from that, we also have 3 pillars where we are saying non-proliferation. That's why you find non-proliferation in our name. And so that we don't add to the problem, which talks about no new expansion and exploration. When we say disarmament, in case of fossil fuel, it's about how do we equitably phase out? How do we reduce the existing threat, what we have? How do we reduce dependence on it? And production should be in line with 1.5 degree target, and then completely move away from it as a peaceful and a just transition. And that's where we require much more equitable way of doing that transition, and also have to make sure that the access to energy is there for poor people. We can't leave poor people behind. That's why this transition has to be a just transition and a much more coordinated, transparent, and planned. So what happens if we delay? If we continue to just demand transition and do not have a framework that's going to help them, it's going to make transition very, very hard. We can lead to financial turmoil, as you saw, if economies have such high dependence on fossil fuel, and if we suddenly, turn off the tap, what's going to happen to them? There is risk to workers. It's going to delay the expansion. It's going to delay economic diversification. You need to shift those workers. For example, if I talk about my country, there is one state that is coal producing state, and there are other states which are heavily into solar power. Now, a coal miner cannot become a solar engineer overnight. You need to plan that transition. You need to do economic diversification. And then there is powerful pro-fossil fuel lobby that's there. So we need, if we delay that, it's going to get even more powerful. It also increases many kinds of economic, legal, and political risks. It also risks dangerous geoengineering. When we talk about climate emergency, if we do not have transition in place, what's going to happen? We'll say, it's too late. Let's do geoengineering. But the reality is the technology is not there yet. And we don't know the risks that these technologies are going to pose. And what's going to happen? We'll see warming increasing. And we already know at 1.1 degree of temperature rise, we have seen massive floods in Europe. We have seen wildfires in Europe and the US and Australia. So it's not just developing countries, even developed countries are very vulnerable to these impacts. So who we are and what we do. So we now have support of more than 100 organizations who have endorsed the treaty. We have a small international support team that I'm part of, and we are working regionally. We have partners working in different regions. We have campaigning on cities. We have media and comms team. We do research, and we also do political advocacy. And these 800 groups that I talked about are spread all over the world. We have a steering committee that's all on the website, so I'm not going to read their names. We have regional partners. We have Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, Third World Network, Climate Action Network South Asia, PowerShift Africa, Stand Earth, and Islands First. So what is our contribution? So on one hand, we are aligning with the world to demand that transition has to be in a manner that we stay below 1.5. We put pressure on governments and talk about international cooperation. We are adding our voice to the global just transition. We are focusing on coal, oil, and gas industry as a whole, and so that we don't also leave workers behind. And we also are using different kinds of analogies, and we're talking about normative shift that we have learned from other treaties. We are working with cities. We are trying to bridge the connect with fossil fuel struggles and many other specific struggles that we have, as I mentioned about the inequality. So we have to talk about supply side, but we also have demand side campaigns. We are working with the frontline struggles. We are looking at finance, divestment, and subsidies. We also want to reduce undue influence of industry. And there are also liability issues. There are already cases where governments are clamping down on fossil fuel industry. They are filing cases against the government to claim compensation, which is so bizarre. So our work has been quoted by media, and there are a lot more coverage that we are getting, attention we are getting, because everybody is now realizing that we should be treating fossil fuels as nuclear weapons. They are as dangerous as that, and we should be supporting the call for treaty. We also got support of Dalai Lama and 100 Nobel Prize winners, and who supported our 3 pillars of the treaty before the Leaders Summit this year. We also have several leading cities like Sydney, Vancouver, Barcelona, Toronto, Los Angeles, and there are many municipal councils that are supporting. We have more than 2,000 scientists and academics who are well-known experts in the areas who are calling for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. So really underlining the need for that also from a scientific perspective. And as we speak, we have a parliamentarians call for a fossil fuel future who we have worked with, and they're talking about coordinating nationally elected officials who are now supporting these 3 pillars. And we have this call initiated by 20 MPs, and we have senators from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Pacific. So we already have 120 signatories from 25 countries. These are the pictures of some of the ones who are leading. So how do we really operate? We are looking at diplomatic engagement as it happens with all international frameworks and treaties. You need a club of countries who champion, who come together, and that's what we are working towards. As more cities and organizations sign on, we've already developed the idea of global registry of fossil fuels. As I said, we are going to document the supply side in terms of the public policies and transparency and accountability on what kind of extraction is happening, where the resources are. And we will also be working towards a global commission on fossil fuel. We are supporting those kind of ideas. We're also working on policy tracker. You will see that being launched at this COP, particularly for civil society. And then, of course, we want that global regime that is going to talk about all these three pillars that we are calling for. So there are a lot of campaign activities that are happening, and you can see our website and what you can do. So you can endorse as an organization. You can promote the video. You'll find the link, and I'll share this presentation. You can call on your own cities in your region to endorse so that we have more voices coming from the government side. And of course, you can join movement. There are many constituencies that we are working with, youth, academics. We also have faith-based community that we are working with right now. And our voices were also taken to the Vatican. We have parliamentarians, and as I said, and you can also join specific such groups and support the cause. And of course, you can work with nationally elected officials to join the parliamentarians who are calling for a fossil fuel-free future. So there's a lot more that you can do. These are our contacts. You can follow us. And yeah, you can join the campaign and talk about it, because this is something that we really want to build together. Thank you so much.